redemption. Why does that word make my skin crawl? What does it really mean? I found a definition online. The act of redeeming, or the state of being redeemed, repurchase, ransom, release, rescue, deliverance, as the redemption of prisoners taken in war, the redemption of a ship and cargo. I also found a more theological definition. The procuring of God's favor by the sufferings and death of Christ, the ransom of deliverance of sinners from the bondage of sin and the penalties of God's violated law. I find both definitions troubling. The act of redeeming implies that I am in some place of captivity, some sort of dungeon where I am hanging on a wall with shackles on my arms and legs. And so to be redeemed means being released from this dungeon. My Christian friends argue that this is a dungeon of my own making, of my own sinfulness. This point of view implies that I would want to be released from my shackles and have no means to do so on my own. Or perhaps this dungeon is like Plato's allegory of the cave, where people are chained facing away from the light, and all they can see are shadows on the wall. Their whole world is defined by the shadows. One person freed from the chains is dragged reluctantly up to the light and sees for the first time the world directly as it is and not as shadows flickering on the wall. He returns to tell the others, still in the cave, about this discovery and is received as a lunatic or a heretic, possibly burned at the stake. The act of redeeming those not wanting redemption can be perceived as offensive, no matter how right it may seem to the Redeemer. The second definition of redemption is even more troubling for me. Why do I need to procure God's favor? Doesn't God love everyone unconditionally? How does sacrificing Jesus on the crucifix show God's mercy for the world? William Ellery Channing says it best when he compares God's atoning salvation through Jesus' death on the cross to the parent unwilling to inflict a penalty on a disobedient but feeble child should persuade a stronger child to bear it. He asks, would not the offender see a more touching mercy in a free forgiveness springing immediately from a parent's heart than in this circuitous remission? Once I thought I had the answers to these questions. I was a Christian attempting to live a first-century style Christianity in the 20th century of the Common Era. I was living a celibate life because as a gay man, that was the only hope for me to work out my salvation in fear and trembling. My very essence was an abomination in the sight of God. My Christian community in which I lived reminded me of this often. Perhaps, just perhaps, if I prayed hard enough, if I sacrificed my natural tendencies just a bit more, I would find redemption from the dungeon of sexual orientation. The carrot at the end of the stick for me was the elusive hope that I would be blessed with an attraction to a woman. We would fall in love and live hetero ever after. Well, I did fall in love with a woman. Yes, it did happen. She was bright and beautiful, witty, easy to be around. I nervously introduced her to my parents, and because Christ would want us to, we were saving ourselves for marriage. The fateful day came when I asked her to marry me. The unimaginable was going to happen. I was expecting to be declared by my Christian community as being fully healed and aligned to my rightful sexual orientation. And then the unimaginable did happen. She came out of the closet as a lesbian and broke off the engagement.
You were saved.
My redemption through marriage was yanked away from me as cruelly as that carrot on the end of the stick is yanked if the donkey gets too close to reaching it. I was devastated. My Christian community told me to keep praying. God would not abandon me, I was assured, but they suggested I was not as healed as they had thought. So once again, I began to pray for salvation from the abomination of my core being. I met someone else a few years later, and then she too came out of the closet. She thanked me for helping her find her true self. And I was left wondering, where was my true self? Where was I to find it? Working out my salvation with fear and trembling became mostly fear and trembling and damned exhaustive. Redemption isn't always about saving grace or procuring God's favor. Sometimes it's procuring favor in our own eyes that is redemptive. How we view ourselves in relation to others around us is important for redemption. How are we in relation to others is key to the redemptive process. My best friend from junior and senior high school was Glenn. We did a lot of things together. He was bright, inquisitive, great with word plays, puns galore, generous to a fault. His friendship was the type of friendship that I hope we all can experience in life. No matter how far away we were in time and space, when we spoke, it was as if only one day had passed since our last meeting. But I must confess, I wasn't always a good friend to Glenn as he was to me. About our third year of college, Glenn and I got together. It had been a while since we had spoken to each other. We took a walk through our small hometown of Port Jervis, New York, and ended up on the bridge crossing the Delaware into Pennsylvania. Overlooking the river below, our conversation turned serious, and Glenn told me the difficult times he was having in college. He told me he had met someone and realized that he was gay. He had decided to drop out of college and move with him to Atlanta, Georgia. Was I supportive? Was I kind? Shamefully, I was not. My reaction was anger. I remember driving to my enclave of Christian community, screaming at God for this turn of events. I wrote a hurtful poem about what Glenn had done and promptly mailed it off to him. It would have seemed that our fates were sealed to spin off in different directions at that point. Glenn did something I could not. He remained steadfast with me as I dealt with his coming out and my going deeper in the closet. It began slowly. Glenn's mom had a great deal to do with it. She would rave about all the things that Glenn and Peter were doing. So, as an intervening figure, she did her part. Fate sometimes twists and turns, and discovering the role that others have in our lives are not always apparent. I began visiting Glenn in Atlanta. We would chat about sexuality and the Bible. Glenn became the exception to the rule. In my eyes, it became all right that Glenn was gay. After all, he was the same person that I knew as a child, who joined me in racing our bikes down Suicide Hill. Only now he was madly in love with another man. For myself, however, to be true to my faith, I furiously clung to my I'm straight persona because I was still looking for salvation from beyond myself. In the 1980s, fear was spreading the country regarding a new disease. Children were being thrown out of their schools, their houses set on fire. Young men were being disowned by their parents, their friends, fired from their jobs, and expelled from their congregations of faith. Nurses and doctors had a name for their patients suffering from this new disease. They called them WOGs, Wrath of God sufferers. Fear was so rampant that it took the death of a prominent actor before President Reagan would even acknowledge its existence. It was within this context that my visit with Glenn in 1987 occurred. One evening, Glenn and I go to a diner. The waitress is wearing a rather peculiar button. It's a simple design, a sewing needle and some thread. Curiosity got the better of me. She told me about the AIDS Memorial Quilt making its first tour of the country en route for its first national display in Washington, D.C. The quilt was in Atlanta, and there was to be a memorial service at the Presbyterian Church. Was she going, I asked. Oh, no, she replied. She had lost 12 of her closest friends to this disease, and the grief would be too overwhelming. 12 friends. I couldn't imagine losing one friend to AIDS, let alone 12. I felt dizzy at what she was going through. As we left the diner, I thought, dear God, who is going to love these people? There are lots of people who can work with the disabled, my career at the time. But who will be for these people? And like all good thoughts and prayers, it floated out into the universe. A day later, Glenn sat me down on the patio and told me that he was HIV positive. I, who could not imagine knowing anyone, suddenly had before me someone I loved with HIV. Upon my return home, I decided I had to do something, anything, to support my friend, even if from afar. And the universe was kind enough to place before me word of an interfaith congregational response to AIDS. This committee of men and women formed what was to become Interfaith AIDS Ministry. I became one of its founders and board president. I kept Glenn informed of my activities. Shortly before his death, I was able to tell Glenn how grateful I am for his presence in my life. I was given the honor of delivering his eulogy at his memorial service. My relationship with Glenn and his partner, however, was not enough to break the hold of my beliefs of who I was in the sight of God. A year after Glenn's death, I stepped into the role of executive director of Interfaith AIDS Ministry. It was in this role that I would meet these wonderful gay couples. One would be HIV positive, the other negative. I noticed something in these relationships that shook the sense of self I had taped together with prayers and scripture verses. They had the same integrity that I thought was an exception within Glenn and Peter's relationship. I provided pastoral care to these couples. AIDS in the early 1990s was a bleak situation. I would go to their houses, hoping to be a channel, something akin to God's abiding love. One couple, however, turned the table on this desire to be a channel of love. The partner was fast approaching the end stage of AIDS. His body was a withered skeleton draped with skin. He could no longer get out of bed. He had no strength, no energy. His healthy partner was there on the bed with him, caressing his forehead with a damp cloth, offering him ice chips to soothe his chafed and cracked lips, whispering to him about nothing and about everything. The light in the room reflected the emotions. Everything seemed cast in gold. I witnessed all of this and gasped. I know what this is. I have seen this before. This This is God's love flowing between them. How could this be? I had been taught that God's love could not dwell in the abominable relationship. One of my board members was Reverend Barbara Peskin, a Unitarian Universalist minister, now retired from the ministry. I had a meeting with her sometime towards the end of June. I don't remember now what the topic of discussion was, but I remember this statement. She asked me if I was doing anything for pride. I looked at her, feigning to be dumbfounded. Pride? She looked me in the eye and said, Fred, we all have to be proud of who we are. Barbara's words haunted me. It began to dawn on me if I was to continue being in relationship with people living with AIDS and their partners, then I needed to be in relationship with me. I could no longer minister to gays if I did not love myself for being gay. If I did not allow the love that I saw flowing between these two committed individuals to also flow within my being, then I could no longer love others regardless of their orientation. Redemption was not some Christ figure paying the ultimate sacrifice for me. Redemption was my friend's willingness to forgive my painful attack, knowing in faith that my love for him would win out. Redemption was a same-sex couple embracing each other with all the tenderness and warmth of two people in love with each other, in love with the essence of life itself. Theirs was a relationship that allowed the fullness of life, come what may, to be embraced. Redemption was a minister's short comment, not even knowing that it was what I needed to hear so desperately. I began attending the Unitarian Universalist congregation after the partner with AIDS had died. I began questioning my Christian faith, had taught me about sexuality. Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing that a God who could be present in the loving relationship of two committed people struggling with the specter of AIDS could then condemn either one of them for the love that dared not speak its name. The fact is, love dared dare to speak its name, and it was as sacred and life-affirming as any love could be in this life. At the Unitarian Universalist congregation I attended, I was encouraged to ask questions. I was encouraged to explore new ways to affirm who I was in this life. This faith enabled me to be a better pastoral caregiver because I was now able to hear where people were in their lives without the judgment and eternity could bring. I began to understand what it meant to live in grace, as Anne Morrow Lindbergh puts it. Slowly, the outward and the inward man were becoming at one. Signs of this became visibly evident for me as I began to simply sit with people who were near death's door. I found no need to be praying for the salvation of their souls or even for their bodies. What I did was simply sit and be present. One man, clearly agitated but no longer able to speak, simply took my hand and we held each other's hand for hours. Words were no longer necessary. Presence was ultimate. When it came time for me to leave, he looked at me and slowly nodded his head, presumably saying thank you. The nurses said he died quietly a few hours later and told me I was the last person to be with him. Redemption is in the mutual acknowledgement of the dignity of a life lived. Redemption comes in the unexpected moments of our humanity and turns us towards wholeness. It is only in our reflection of these moments do we realize we were in the presence of something holy, something sacred, something redemptive. Blessed be.